In a quiet town in upstate New York, a tragedy unfolded that shocked doctors, investigators, and an entire nation. 5 children from the same family died one after another. Each death seemed sudden. Each death seemed unexplained. And each time, doctors gave the same heartbreaking explanation: sudden infant death syndrome, often called SIDS. For years, the community believed this family had simply suffered an unimaginable series of tragedies. But decades later, investigators uncovered a disturbing truth that would turn one grieving mother into one of the most infamous killers in American history. This is the story of Wanetta Hoyt. Wanetta and her husband, Tim Hoyt, lived in Oneonta, a small city in upstate New York. It was a kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where families raised their children in quiet neighborhoods, and where crime was almost unheard of. In the early years of their marriage, Wanetta and Tim dreamed of starting a family. Like many young couples, they hoped for a house filled with laughter and children. Their first child, a baby boy named Eric, was born in 1965. At first, everything seemed normal. Eric appeared to be a healthy infant, and the young parents were excited about their new life as a family. But when Eric was just 3 months old, tragedy struck. One day, Eric suddenly stopped breathing. Despite efforts to save him, the infant died. Doctors could not find a clear explanation for what had happened. They believed the cause might be related to breathing problems, something that was not uncommon in infants. At the time, medical knowledge about sudden infant deaths was extremely limited. Eric's death was heartbreaking, but many people believed it was simply a tragic accident. Wanetta and Tim were devastated. Still, they tried to move forward with their lives. Not long afterward, Wanetta became pregnant again. Their second child, a baby girl named Julie, was born. For a short time, the family felt hope again. Julie seemed healthy and energetic. But when Julie was just 4 months old, another tragedy occurred. One day, Julie suddenly died after reportedly choking on rice cereal. The explanation seemed plausible at the time. Doctors believed the infant had accidentally choked while eating. It was another terrible loss. But few people imagined that the nightmare was only beginning. Sometime later, Wanetta and Tim welcomed their third child, a boy named Jimmy. Jimmy grew older than the other children had. For more than 2 years, everything seemed normal. Then, one day, Jimmy suddenly cried out for his mother. Witnesses later said the toddler shouted "Mommy" before collapsing. Jimmy died shortly afterward. He was 2.5 years old. Doctors again struggled to find a clear cause of death. The case was unusual. Sudden infant death syndrome usually affected infants under the age of 1. Yet Jimmy was much older. Still, his death was eventually treated as another unexplained tragedy. By this point, many people in the community felt sympathy for the Hoyt family. Losing 3 children was something almost no family could endure. But some people quietly began to wonder how such a terrible pattern could happen to one household. Despite the losses, Wanetta became pregnant again. Their 4th child, Molly, was born. Around this time, a pediatric specialist named Dr. Alfred Steinschneider became involved in the case. Steinschneider was researching sudden infant deaths and believed that breathing pauses, known as apnea, might be responsible for SIDS. When he learned about the Hoyt family's history, he saw an opportunity to study the condition. Molly was placed under medical observation. Doctors attached a monitor that would sound an alarm if the baby stopped breathing. At the time, this type of monitoring was extremely rare. During her stay at the clinic, Molly's monitor occasionally sounded alarms, but the episodes were not always serious. Eventually, Molly was allowed to go home with her parents. Not long after returning home, tragedy struck again. One day, the monitor alarm went off. By the time help arrived, Molly was dead. Doctors again struggled to explain what had happened. Some medical professionals believed she had died of pneumonia. Others suspected SIDS. Dr. Steinschneider became convinced that the Hoyt children were suffering from a rare genetic form of sudden infant death syndrome. He later published a medical paper based on the Hoyt family's experience. The paper suggested that SIDS could run in families. His research gained widespread attention and influenced medical thinking about infant deaths for years. Meanwhile, Wanetta became pregnant once again. Their fifth child, a baby boy named Noah, was born. Because of the family's history, doctors closely monitored Noah. Like Molly, he was placed on breathing monitors designed to detect apnea episodes. Several times, Noah was brought back to the hospital after breathing incidents at home. Nurses who observed Wanetta during these hospital visits later reported something unusual. Some felt that Wanetta appeared emotionally distant from the baby. However, many assumed this was simply the result of grief. After losing 4 children, bonding with another baby might have been emotionally difficult. Eventually, Noah was allowed to return home. Less than a day later, he was dead. Doctors once again recorded the death as a respiratory illness. For the Hoyt family, it was the 5th devastating loss. After Noah's death, Tim Hoyt made a difficult decision. He underwent a vasectomy, so the couple would not have more biological children. Years later, the couple adopted a baby girl. Unlike the other children, the adopted child survived and grew up healthy. As time passed, the Hoyt family tried to move forward. Dr. Steinschneider's research continued to gain recognition. His theory that apnea might lead to SIDS helped popularize the use of home breathing monitors for infants. The medical industry began producing monitoring devices for families worried about sudden infant deaths. For many years, the Hoyt family's tragedy remained an accepted example of genetic SIDS. But the story was far from over. In the early 1990s, a prosecutor in another county began investigating a man accused of killing his own children for insurance money. During the trial, the defense cited Steinschneider's research about the Hoyt family as evidence that multiple SIDS deaths could occur in one family. However, the prosecution's medical experts challenged that claim. Some experts argued that while one unexplained infant death might be SIDS, multiple deaths in the same household were extremely suspicious. This debate caught the attention of investigators in Oneonta. District Attorney Bob Simpson decided to review the Hoyt case. He requested all available medical records related to the children's deaths. The records were sent to forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden for analysis. Dr. Baden was a highly respected medical examiner with experience in complex death investigations. When he reviewed the files, he noticed several troubling inconsistencies. For example, the reports did not provide strong medical evidence for the causes of death listed in the records. In several cases, the explanations given by earlier doctors did not match the medical findings. The more investigators studied the case, the more suspicious it appeared. Another medical expert, Dr. Vincent DeMaio, also examined the evidence. He concluded that the children's deaths were not consistent with SIDS. In fact, he believed the deaths were more likely the result of homicide. One particular case stood out. Jimmy, the 2.5-year-old boy. SIDS almost never occurs in children that age. The circumstances of his death were extremely unusual. According to reports, Jimmy had been healthy that day. Then he suddenly cried out for his mother before collapsing. Witnesses described blood coming from his nose and mouth. For experienced forensic investigators, those symptoms raise a disturbing possibility: suffocation. By this point, investigators believe the deaths might not have been accidents at all. But proving such a crime would be extremely difficult. Most of the deaths had occurred decades earlier. Many of the doctors and medical officials involved were no longer alive. There were no eyewitnesses, and the physical evidence was limited. Investigators realized that the case would likely depend on one thing: a confession. In 1994, police brought Wanetta Hoyt in for questioning. The interview lasted several hours. At first, investigators spoke calmly with her about the past. They discussed her children, her marriage, and the tragedies she had endured. Eventually, investigators began presenting the medical evidence. They told Wanetta that experts believed the children had not died of natural causes. At first, she denied the accusations. She insisted that the children had died from SIDS. But as the interview continued, her emotions began to change. At one point, Wanetta lowered her head and began crying. Then she asked investigators a question: "What will people think of me?" Shortly afterward, Wanetta Hoyt confessed. She admitted that she had smothered all 5 of her children. According to her confession, Eric had been the first. She said she smothered him while he lay on the couch. Julie was next. Wanetta said she pressed the infant's face against her chest until she stopped breathing. Jimmy, the toddler, had cried outside the bathroom door. Wanetta said she took him into the living room and suffocated him with a towel. Molly was smothered with a pillow. And Noah, the youngest, was also suffocated shortly after coming home from a hospital. Investigators were stunned by the confession. In 1995, Wanetta Hoyt was charged with 5 counts of second-degree murder. The trial drew national attention. Prosecutors argued that the deaths had been carefully disguised as natural tragedies. They also suggested that Wanetta may have suffered from a psychological condition sometimes associated with caregivers who harm children in order to gain sympathy or attention. During the trial, Dr. Steinschneider testified for the defense. He continued to support his original research and maintained that the children's deaths were consistent with SIDS. However, prosecutors pointed out that Wanetta had already confessed to killing the children. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached a verdict. The verdict in the trial of Wanetta Hoyt marked the end of a case that had haunted investigators for years. But for many people, the story was far from over. For decades, the deaths of the Hoyt children have been used as a key example in medical discussions about sudden infant death syndrome. Doctors, researchers, and even parenting magazines had cited the case as evidence that SIDS might run in families. Now, that belief was being called into question. If Wanetta Hoyt had truly murdered her children, it meant that one of the most influential examples used in SIDS research had been built on a terrible misunderstanding. The revelation forced many in the medical community to reconsider how infant deaths were investigated. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the understanding of SIDS was still evolving. Many doctors believed it was connected to breathing problems or other biological conditions that cause infants to stop breathing during sleep. Because the exact cause was unknown, SIDS became a diagnosis that was often used when no other explanation could be found. In some cases, it was simply the only answer available. But the Hoyt case demonstrated something deeply troubling. Sometimes, what looked like unexplained natural deaths might actually be something else entirely. Investigators later explained that one of the key warning signs in the Hoyt family had been the number of deaths in a single household. While SIDS does tragically occur, multiple unexplained infant deaths within the same family are extremely rare. Today, many forensic experts follow a general rule when reviewing such cases. 1 unexplained infant death may be a tragedy. 2 deaths raise serious concern. 3 deaths are often treated as potential homicide until proven otherwise. In the Hoyt case, there have been 5. Another factor that raised suspicion was the timing of the deaths. Each child had died while Wanetta was alone with them. There were no witnesses. And in most cases, the children had appeared healthy shortly before their deaths. These details became clearer once investigators began reviewing the records decades later. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Wanetta had taken advantage of the limited medical understanding of SIDS at the time. By the time the final child died, doctors were already inclined to believe that the Hoyt family carried a genetic risk. That assumption helped shield Wanetta from suspicion. Her reputation as a grieving mother also played a role. Friends and neighbors described her as someone who had endured unimaginable loss. People brought sympathy, support, and comfort to the family. Few could imagine that the mother at the center of the tragedy might be responsible. This reaction, according to psychologists, is not unusual in cases involving crimes against children. Society tends to view mothers as protectors. The idea that a parent could intentionally harm their own child is deeply difficult for many people to accept. As a result, warning signs are sometimes overlooked. In the Hoyt case, several nurses who had interacted with Wanetta years earlier later reported feeling uneasy about her behavior. Some said she appeared emotionally distant from the infants. Others felt she did not respond to medical concerns in the way most parents would. At the time, those observations were not treated as evidence of wrongdoing. Instead, they were often attributed to grief or emotional exhaustion. Only years later did those memories take on new significance. During the police interrogation that led to her confession, investigators used a careful strategy. They knew that directly accusing Wanetta might cause her to shut down. Instead, they allowed the conversation to develop slowly. They talked about the past. They discussed her children and the tragedies that had defined her life. Gradually, they introduced the possibility that the deaths might not have been natural. When they told her that medical experts believed the children had been suffocated, the emotional pressure began to build. Investigators later described the moment when Wanetta finally broke down. She began crying and worried aloud about what people would think of her. That moment was a turning point. Once she began speaking about her fears of public judgment, the confession followed. In many ways, the confession shocked even the investigators who had suspected the truth. Listening to the details of each child's death was deeply disturbing. Yet the calm manner in which Wanetta described the events left a lasting impression on those present. Some investigators later said that the emotional weight of the case stayed with them for years. For Tim Hoyt, the children's father, the confession was devastating. He had believed for decades that his family had been the victim of terrible medical misfortune. When police informed him that his wife had confessed, he initially refused to believe it. According to investigators, Tim insisted that the confession must have been forced. He could not accept the idea that the woman he had trusted had killed their children. During the trial, prosecutors presented the confession as the central piece of evidence. Although physical evidence from the decades-old deaths was limited, the confession provided a detailed account that matched many of the medical observations investigators had uncovered. Jurors listened carefully as witnesses described the events surrounding each child's death. Medical experts testified that the symptoms described in several cases were consistent with suffocation. The defense, however, argued that Wanetta's confession was unreliable. They claimed she had been emotionally vulnerable during the interrogation and may have said what investigators wanted to hear. Dr. Alfred Steinschneider, whose research had helped popularize the idea of genetic SIDS, testified in support of the defense. He maintained that the children's deaths were consistent with the apnea-related theory he had studied. However, prosecutors pointed out that Steinschneider had based much of his research on the Hoyt family itself. If Wanetta had been responsible for the deaths, then the foundation of that research would be deeply flawed. This realization sparked significant debate within the medical community after the trial. Some researchers began re-examining earlier cases of unexplained infant death. In response to cases like the Hoyt investigation, medical examiners and law enforcement agencies began developing more detailed protocols for investigating infant fatalities. Autopsies became more thorough. Investigators began paying closer attention to family history and circumstances surrounding each death. The goal was to ensure that genuine medical tragedies were not mistaken for criminal acts, and that criminal acts were not mistaken for medical tragedies. The Hoyt case also brought increased attention to a psychological condition often discussed in cases involving harm to children. This condition, sometimes referred to as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, involves caregivers who intentionally cause illness or harm in someone under their care in order to gain attention or sympathy. However, experts caution that determining motivation in cases like these is extremely complex. During the trial, different theories were discussed about why Wanetta may have killed her children. Some suggested she may have been overwhelmed by the responsibilities of motherhood. Others believed she may have been seeking sympathy and attention from the community. Still others believed the exact motive might never be fully understood. What remained certain was a tragic outcome. 5 children had lost their lives. Their deaths had been hidden behind medical explanations that went unchallenged for years. After her conviction, Wanetta Hoyt was sentenced to 5 consecutive prison terms of 15 years each. She was sent to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York. There, she would spend the remainder of her life behind bars. In 1998, only a few years after her conviction, Wanetta Hoyt died of pancreatic cancer while still serving her sentence. Her death closed the final chapter of the criminal case. But the legacy of the investigation continued. Forensic experts often cite the Hoyt case as a reminder of how difficult it can be to distinguish between natural death and homicide when dealing with infants. Because infants are physically fragile, and because some causes of death leave little physical evidence, determining what happened can be extremely challenging. This reality makes careful investigation essential. Today, sudden infant death syndrome is still recognized as a genuine medical condition. However, doctors and investigators now approach repeated infant deaths within a single family with far greater scrutiny. Medical professionals emphasize the importance of thorough autopsies, detailed scene investigations, and careful review of family history. These practices are designed to prevent tragedies like the Hoyt case from being misunderstood for decades. For the community of Oneonta, the case remains one of the most shocking events in the town's history. Many residents remember the years when the Hoyt family was known only as a symbol of heartbreaking loss. The later discovery that those deaths had been murders forced the community to confront a very different reality. It also served as a reminder that appearances can sometimes hide darker truths. Even today, the story continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and medical professionals, not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of the lessons they revealed about investigation, science, and the importance of questioning assumptions. The deaths of the Hoyt children remain a tragic chapter in the history of forensic science. 5 young lives lost, a community searching for answers, and a case that forever changed how investigators look at the most heartbreaking deaths imaginable.